Welcome and thank you for coming out today. I'm Charmaine Jackman and the founder of the Social Justice and Mental Health Conversation Series. I will serve as a moderator today. Before we get started, I want to give a special thanks to Lisa and the Village Works for hosting this event today. They've been generous in donating our space for these conversations. Again, thank you for supporting this series. I started this conversation series back in December because I saw a need for mental health professionals to figure out strategies to deal with their biases that come up in therapy in their professional spaces and to navigate discrimination that might show up in therapy. So far, we've addressed racism and sexism, and next month we'll be addressing LGBTQ issues, such as transphobia and homophobia. We'll take a break in the summer to reflect and locate new sponsors and panelists for our upcoming series. We hope to tackle issues like immigration, religious issues, and other issues such as racism that come up in our therapy work. In addition to organizing the conversation series, I'm the founder of Innovative Psychological Services, a private practice where I provide individual therapy, consultations, forensic assessments, and business development coaching for people looking to launch or grow their private practices. One of my personal and professional goals is to destigmatize mental health and to increase access to quality and culturally competent mental health care. As you know, May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and I wanted to tackle an issue that addressed mental health care access and utilization. In the US, over 50% of people with a mental health condition do not receive treatment, and the data is more staggering for people of color. Research shows that 80 to 90% of people of color do not access mental health treatment. The reasons individuals do not seek treatment are varied and include healthcare costs, mental health stigma, limited or no health insurance coverage, out-of-pocket costs, lack of providers, geographical challenges, and lack of culturally competent services. As a result, access to quality, culturally competent mental health care has become a social, public health, and equity issue. So what better topic than to think about technology and mental health care access? When you think of technology and mental health, what are the first things that come to mind? People often think about privacy, safety, and ethical issues. Well, I wanted to change that initial reaction. I wanted to think about access. How many people regularly use technology in their practice? According to the Pew Research Center, 74% of the US population use the internet and 77% use smartphones. When I consider the future of mental health, we know that technology will be playing a greater role. If you're a digital native, someone born after 1980, this is obvious and inevitable. But if you are a digital immigrant like myself and my colleagues, this seems like an absolutely terrifying possibility. So we hold on to the fear and bury our heads in the sand and hope that it will pass. But one thing we know for sure is that technology is not going anywhere. It's here to stay. And in fact, it's only getting faster and more sophisticated. As a result, our ethics and policies and practice are way behind. So technology in mental health is an area of uncharted territory. Here's some data that mental health practitioners need to be aware of. 1 in 10 people in the US use smartphones only and do not access broadband services at home. They're called smartphone dependents. In the world, 50% of people use the internet, and 66% of people in the world have mobile devices. When we think of the person who is smartphone reliant, there are people who are younger adults, non-whites, and lower income Americans. These are people who really need access to mental health care. There are platforms like Talkspace, BetterHelp that are disrupting the mental health delivery system industry. And mental health professionals need to lean into this information. Today we'll hear from Andy Reimer, whose new company, Shield, is at the forefront of mental health promotion through social connection platforms like Snapchat. And from Chetan Jaravari from Sophia, who aims to disrupt the therapy search and referral process. We'll also hear from Dr. Weinstein, whose research is on digital citizenship and how we can educate the next generation to engage in responsible technology use. And finally, Dr. Workington will discuss professional issues related to technology and practice. We'll start out by having each panelist talk about their cultural identity and their social justice philosophy, and then they'll talk about how technology impacts their mental health practice. Thank you. So let me start. Here we go. And thank you again. Did I say that already?
Yeah.
One of my mentors always said, always be thankful. So, Emily, you're going to start by sharing your cultural identity and then how social justice plays a role, or what's your social justice philosophy, and how that may impact, how that may show up in your professional work, and then talk about your experience with technology and how you're using that in your profession.
Okay. I think all three are hopefully related. So I'm Emily Weinstein. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. So my primary orientation to this work is as a researcher, which makes me especially excited to also hear your questions and thoughts and reactions. So Charmaine sent us these questions ahead of time, so I had a little bit of time to think. But when I got her email last night at 10, as I was sitting down with my cup of tea, I thought immediately about three aspects, I guess, of my identity and background. So the first is that in my house, when I was growing up, dinner always, I grew up in the New York area, and dinners began with the question, whose night is it? And the reason they began with whose night is it is because my mom is Christian, and her preference is to pray before dinner. And my dad is Jewish, tending towards atheist, and his preference is not to pray before dinner. And my parents are still married. Today's actually their 31st wedding anniversary. And so I was thinking about this in particular around today. But I grew up in a house where the way that they managed their different identities was that we alternated nights. So on mom's night, we said a prayer before dinner, and on dad's night, no prayer before dinner. And it was just every other night, or something roughly to that effect. And I think that played a big role in shaping my and my sister's identities, because there was a sense that everyone's views are welcome around the table, and that disagreement doesn't mean that we can't all not only coexist, but really practice living with each other's views and values. So I was thinking about that aspect of my identity. The second is that my grandmother was a Head Start educator in Chicago in the 60s. And I have been thinking about that a lot recently. I didn't know that when I actually started a doctoral program in education. But I've been thinking a lot about that as it relates to the idea of access and of wanting more access to high quality services as being such an important part of my belief system, and I think my family's history and narrative as well. And then the third thing, which I think also relates to your second question, is one of my sisters has high functioning autism, and so I think a lot not only about access, but also, and not only about that sort of equal access, but also about the equity challenges around not just providing access, but making sure we're providing access that's really accessible, and meeting people where they are, and then making sure that our supports and services are actually addressing whatever their needs are. So that's kind of my personal, I think, orientation to this work. And in my research, what that looks like is thinking a lot about individual needs and supports and paths and experiences. So, okay, so that's the context. So shifting into the second question, which was about how technology can be used to increase mental health care access, and also why this is important. I know you're going to hear about some ways that technologies can increase access just by providing high quality evidence-based practice to people who might not otherwise have access to those supports and resources. I'm really excited about this, I think, for two specific reasons. The first is related, I love that you brought up the idea of being from a rural area. So I think the idea that we'll be able to mitigate some geographic barriers that can get in the way of accessing care is really interesting and important. I was thinking about statistics someone shared recently, which is that there's in India one psychiatrist for every 343,000 people. And so when you live in an area where there aren't a lot of mental health care providers, how do we think about technology as maybe bridging to access? The second thing I think is stigma, which can prevent, I know if you're nodding, so I know can prevent people in certain communities or from certain backgrounds or populations from seeking support even once they've recognized they need it and want it. And I'm really excited about the potential for technology to mitigate that, which I see as another barrier to care. And in the US in particular, it seems like technology is going to be is such an obvious way to reach people because I study adolescents. In the US, over 94% of adolescents now use social media sites. There's a statistic that is actually from 2016, so I bet this is higher now, but that the average iPhone user touches his or her phone 2,617 times per day. So Andy and I have been talking about the idea that that's basically 2,617 potential intervention moments where if we have accessible services ready to go, we can really meet people where they're at. So I'm excited about both of those things. But what I actually want to talk about today, are you keeping time on me? Will you?
Yes, ma'am. You have about a little less than 7 minutes.
Perfect. Okay. So I actually want to talk about something that's not just the way I think technology is increasing access, but really encourage you to bring technology into the therapy room. And the reason that I think this is actually so relevant to this conversation is because this is fundamentally about thinking about the intersection of technology and mental health. And anyone who reads the newspaper or online news articles and headlines probably has a sense that there's some buzz in the research community about potential influences of technology on our mental health. So often we see this in the form of headlines that suggest that Facebook is causing depression, or something to that effect. I read the research that is often reported in those headlines and articles, and I would say on a high level, the first thing is to recognize that the research often points to nuance and to some differentiation in people's experiences that is frequently not part of how the headlines are formed. So we might find, for example, that certain kinds of Facebook use for certain people under certain circumstances is associated with an increase in depression. Or maybe even there's experimental findings that's causal, but it's for a certain age group. And we're just making generalizations about who is and isn't affected, and how. I spent most of the last 10 years studying how adolescents use social apps like Snapchat and Instagram. And one of the things that we see so clearly is, I think, when we look at people's individual experiences and narratives, is that social media can be both protective and it can be a source of both protective factors and risk factors. So it can be a way that people are accessing really meaningful social supports, expressing their identities in ways that they're finding really affirming and validating, accessing pro-recovery content and communities, and it can also be a way that they're feeling really socially isolated because they find out that they were excluded, or they're accessing depressogenic content that is actively making them feel worse, very anti-recovery oriented. And sometimes it's not actually about what they're. And I'll just say one example that I've been hearing about more and more is the pro-ANA and pro-MIA, so pro-anorexia and pro-bulimia communities and hashtags on Instagram, and the potential to really engage with content that could reinforce an eating disorder. And adolescents who struggle with some of those issues will describe that content as triggering. They're aware of it, but it has a strong pull for different reasons. This is so interesting and important, and I think exciting on the positive side and concerning on the negative side. And that's all to say, I think it's at the very least it's something that's worth talking about with your clients and asking about, and trying to understand what about their social media experiences is positive and what about it is challenging, and then what does it look like to actually try and intervene in the challenges in a really targeted and effective way. And then beyond that, I think what you're looking at and what sort of communities you're interacting with is a really important part of the equation, but it's also not the full story, because one of the other things that we are seeing in the research is that adolescents, and I think everyone, but I focus specifically on adolescents, can look at the same social media content and have very different reactions. So I'm thinking about two adolescents who I interviewed back to back a couple of weeks ago, and one of them was talking, this was actually in the context of some adolescents who had recent psychiatric emergencies, and we were talking about social media. And one of them, they were both teenage boys, and one of them was describing how looking at pictures of other people's vacations and new computers and technology could make him feel really bad in comparison, like make him feel like his own life didn't measure up, and really inspire social comparison that we know leads to feeling like your own life just doesn't compare. Like this person, everyone is so much happier than me. Everyone has such better stuff than me. And this is something that I actually think most people who use social media can relate to on some level. Like we've had an experience of seeing someone who just seems to have such a perfect and happy life. And literally, I think it was the next day, I interviewed another adolescent boy who similar age who said that when he was also struggling with depression, but for him, when he sees those kinds of posts, they make him feel inspired and like other people are happy and maybe someday he could be happy too. And so I was really puzzling, I've been grappling with, I think, this reality that, number one, there's just a huge variation in what adolescents are looking at, who they're connecting with, and what experiences they're having. And that can be consequential for their mental health. And two, that even if we knew exactly what they're looking at, we're not going to know how they're making sense of it. So we really need to enter the conversation with an openness and non-judgmental stance to try and understand what their experience is like. But I think if we recognize 2,617 taps per day, and we're not even going to ask about this aspect of their lives, it feels like such a missed opportunity to understand something that we know can have a really consequential influence on their everyday lives and experiences and mental health. So I think that's I'll pause. Oh, actually, I wanted to say one more thing. Sorry. Okay. Do I have 30 more seconds? Okay. The other thing I was going to say is that I've been really struck recently by, and this will segue into, I think, whoever's next, but I've been struck recently by, in that positive category, the ways that adolescents are using their smartphones really actively around coping strategies and skills. So meditation apps, breathing apps, even like apps that are meant to distract you when you have a desire to self-harm. And so I think that's a sort of segue, but that's an area where I think attending to the mental health implications and recognizing that they might not all be negative becomes really important.
Thank you. And I would definitely agree. I work with adolescents as well. I work at a high school, my day job. And I've found using apps, like my go-to is Stop, Breathe, Think app. And I actually have a student who's like, I actually use it and it works. And so really encouraging that practice. And I think the one thing I would just add, kind of what you're saying, like technology is here. It's not going anywhere. It's only getting faster, more complex, and sophisticated. So I think we really have to take it on and embrace it and figure out how to integrate it well. But we have to figure out how to integrate it. Okay. So I'm going to open up for one or two questions. You guys have for Emily? Comments?
Disagreements?
Disagreements?
It's like anecdotal stories. So I saw clients for therapy this year at a hospital, and a girl was definitely she was on the autism spectrum, and so it's interesting to see how someone in that like kind of category might deal with technology in an even different way, and how it can bring about different struggles, different, and how to interact with it. So interesting to think about.
And did it seem like it was more challenging, more beneficial? Did you see both? Were you able to see both in that short period of time?
For her, I'd say it was just kind of neutral, pros and
Yeah.
cons, because the relationship with her friend, was going to be there no matter what, but this was just kind of how they would communicate. But it was definitely helpful that she felt comfortable to bring that into the room, and that we just basically talked about their interactions, not just in person, but through the phone, that
Yeah.
were really hard to, working on problem solving and things like that, so it was cool. Yeah.
I'm curious about your take on parental controls in terms of social media and how that, or the lack thereof, and how that impacts the way that adolescents engage with it more or less.
Okay, so maybe this is will feel like a cop-out answer, but I think we have to put this in a developmental context. So, what I might recommend for the parent of a young child is like different than I would typically recommend for the parent of a 17-year-old. But in general, I think the goal is that we're helping kids develop the skills to self-regulate their relationships with technology, and to keep themselves safe and engaged, and to be thinking morally and ethically and civically, hopefully. And so I think that we have to be thinking about what it looks like to help them get there and build the skills they need. That might involve like a sort of a gradual release. So starting up front with more supervision, monitoring, and restrictions, and then as kids get older and demonstrate that they're that they really have earned the trust, being prepared to like really reassess and step back from it. But I think that hinges on, I would say the huge caveat to that is I think it's helpful for kids to know that their parents are monitoring, and for parents to convey why they think it's important to monitor. Otherwise, I think it can undermine the trust between the parent and the child, and sort of that can backfire. That's especially important because of that, what I was saying about like, even if you know what they're looking at, you might not understand the sense making that's happening for them around it. And one thing that we see sometimes is like parents can think if they're monitoring, their job is done. And actually that can miss so many of the critical moments where kids actually need support. And so if you can instead, or in addition to, really think about what it looks like to open the lines of communication, I think that's often even more effective. What do you think?
What I find with parents, and I think it's a generational thing, where it's hard to understand this intensity and need to be on something so many times throughout the day, whereas before, and have so much access to your friends. So parents grew up where it was just like, I saw my friends at school, then I didn't see them until the next day. Whereas their child is like, I'm still on the phone at night, and I think for them they're just like, just stop it, but not getting that. I think, as you said, technology is here. Like, you can't keep your child away from it, and that's not always the appropriate thing to do, as opposed to just engage with them.
I think part of why the developmental lens is so helpful for what you said too is actually like this desire for peer connectivity is not new. Like, technology didn't create this. It's just sort of hitting this perfect sweet spot or vulnerability point, depending on how you look at it. But it is true that parents didn't have the experience. They left school at the end of the day. But I find like most parents can relate to the experience if they had a phone in their house, of like staying up all night talking to their best friend or to the person they had a crush on. And they probably wouldn't do that today in their adult self, but they can relate to this idea that in adolescence they had this real desire for connection. They just had different access to sort of technologies and mediums. So.
And their parents had the same reaction.
Yeah, definitely.
But I actually push back on that too, and I say, like, we always kind of point to adolescents, but when I look around, the adults are doing the same thing. And so, when I always say adolescents and adults who use their phone, we're really tied to it because it's this immediate access to information and communication with people who we care about.
So much modeling.
I always, it's modeling, and so I say, say, it's not just the adolescents, so let's not just point the finger.
Thank you for the question.
All right, so we will move on to Jennifer.
So I'm Jennifer Workington. I'm a licensed psychologist. So I do have a small private practice working in geriatrics. So technology never really comes into the picture because they're still working on the flip phones, like the jitterbugs that you see the commercials for. So I'm not really here for that part of what I do. I'm here more because I'm the Director of Professional Affairs for the Massachusetts Psychological Association. And within that role, I do a lot of advocacy work, I do a lot of training work, and I do a lot of professional consults for example, for members that want to add teletherapy to their practice or learn more about kind of how to branch out. In terms of my cultural identity, it's always one of those like deep thoughts questions. When I think about it, I grew up just outside of DC, so it was a very kind of multicultural area. It wasn't uncommon for my friends' parents to not speak English, and I learned all about the world because I would go to someone's house and eat like a genuine Pakistani dinner, and we were kind of blissfully unaware that it wasn't like that, in most places in the U.S., and that just seemed normal. When I was a teenager, we ended up moving to a farm in rural Georgia. Totally different type of culture, huge culture shock for me, and so I got a sense of what is it like to kind of just feel like you're in an entirely different country, because everything is kind of done differently and beliefs are different, and people were openly saying racist and sexist and homophobic kinds of things, and that was okay in that particular culture. And so I got a sense of what that was like. And the flip side of it, the reason that we ended up moving there is because my mom had filed bankruptcy, we had lost our house, so we were in a really economically disadvantaged state. So we were like collectors calling all the time, like that kind of experience. And so we had moved in with my grandparents, and so it was this whole kind of, in the midst of all of this, there's also, we don't have any money, and just kind of figuring out like, how do you go to college when you don't have any money? How do you like do everything that you need to do when you come from a family where your parents can't, help you out with that? And so I think that also made me very sensitive to the struggles that a lot of people come up with that, throughout their life. And I think it also just has a lasting impact kind of on your psyche when you've had those kinds of experiences in your youth. So that's kind of my professional development. In terms of how it incorporates into my kind of professional role, I was like the kid that always wanted to be a psychologist. I said that when I was like 8, and I was like, that's what's gonna happen. Even as a kid, I was always like the empath. I was like, oh, someone's getting bullied, like I need to go intervene, like this isn't okay. And so for me, empathy and taking care of other people and helping other people kind of find themselves was just always a part of my psyche. And so I kind of carry that with me. So I think that's kind of like the first question. A lot of what we're looking at these days is teletherapy in clinical practice. I am similarly in the kind of edge of like being really okay with technology and really not okay with technology. And so, and my training was done in the early 2000s. So, we were using like VHS tapes. The whole idea that technology would be incorporated into a clinical session was so foreign to us. So we got no training in like, how do you do teletherapy? And so I'm very sympathetic to our members that struggle with this notion of, is it gonna be as good as in-person therapy? Like, how do you adapt all of these things that we do to a teletherapy context? And it must be worse, right? We have this image in our mind, it's not what I learned, so it must not be as effective, which is really not the case. There's some things that are actually more effective in a teletherapy scenario. So, for example, people admitting something that they're ashamed of or that's difficult to talk about. We've particularly seen this in studies with veterans. that are getting treatment for substance abuse, they're more able to share those kinds of things to their therapist when their therapist isn't physically in the room. That by having that distance, by not feeling like you're right next to the person, that there's some things that people are better able to discuss because it feels a little safer. It feels like they're further away. And so there's really interesting findings like that, that, you know, all of the research basically demonstrates teletherapy is just as effective as in-person therapy, and each has their own kind of pros and cons. And it's a really important area for access, and this is where a little bit of my identity kind of comes in too. Because when we think about access to therapy, you know, sometimes people are thinking, oh, like the money to be able to go to therapy. Certainly that's a part of it. But you also have to think, so that's the hour that you're gonna be in therapy. How long is it gonna take you to get to the therapy session? How long is it gonna take you to get home from the therapy session? Now we're maybe getting into 2 hours, maybe longer. Does the person have the luxury to spend 2 hours outside of their home? Can they afford childcare if that's an issue? Can they afford public transportation to get to and from a therapy situation? So it's this irony that, you know, we tend to think of like the rural communities as being these kinds of deserts of mental health professionals, and it's absolutely the case that we see that in rural communities. But we also see that in really urban communities. If you look for a therapist in Roxbury, you're not going to find as many people as if you look for a therapist in the Back Bay. You know, there's these areas of the city that are simply more difficult to get to a therapist. And so I think it's really important to be thinking about access beyond just helping out people that are perhaps physically disadvantaged, can't physically get to a therapist. You know, I think it's a bias that many of us have, that you just think, oh, you can spend the time to go and not think about what the cost is to be gone from your home for that time. So, you know, having something like teletherapy opens the door now to maybe a single mom who can't afford childcare but can spend the time in the home, you know, the kids in the other room. Suddenly therapy is an option because you can use your phone, and you can easily do that in your home. If you have someone that has lots of kids, you know, childcare is an issue. And we also see that with people that have a lot of medical issues. One in particular is cancer patients. If you're a cancer patient, you can't just be hopping on the T and being exposed to lots of germs. If you're going through some kind of immunosuppressive therapy, you probably do need therapy though, because there's a lot going on. So then you get into either the therapist has to go to your house, or you have to be really careful about what therapist you go to and how you get to the person. And so again, there's all of these kinds of scenarios and locations where providing the option for teletherapy, again, you can do it right on your smartphone, brings that option to so many different people for so many different reasons. So it's really important from that perspective. And I'm trying to remember what else I was going to talk about. So the other thing that I would just kind of caution more from the kind of practice perspective, a lot of times people think, oh, I'm just going to set up my laptop with the camera in it, right? And like do some FaceTime or some Skyping with a client and like voila, I now offer teletherapy. And it's not that simple. You do have to be very cautious about the technology that you're using, about maintaining privacy. And you do need to do some training on the differences in risk management. So for example, if I'm sitting across from somebody and they're suicidal and I'm really concerned about their safety, I can at least be there with them, call somebody, whatever. If you're doing that with someone who's somewhere else, what do you do if you're seriously concerned about their well-being? It's not like you can go over and give them a hug and make sure they stay in your office. And you know, what do you do if you lose video in the middle of that kind of conversation? So there's a lot of new things to consider. And you do have to be thoughtful about how you adapt your particular approach to match the medium, the technology that you're using. And so kind of along that line, to my plug. So there's some papers over there I'm actually doing a training, guess what, on teletherapy and how to add it to your practice. So I'm doing that in June. It's a really popular training. It's one of the more popular ones that we offer. Again, because it's essentially, you know, a lot of the clinicians that are considering it these days are people that already are practicing in some way and want to add that on. I think the younger clinicians are coming out saying, sure, I can just do teletherapy, and they feel more comfortable with it, but most clinicians are not in that group. And so it's about how do you begin to incorporate that as an option for your clients for, you know, snowstorms or whatever it is that may come up. So I think I'm close to time. So any questions or comments?
So I'll say before we open it up, two comments. One of the things that I've heard you say is
I'm talking about simultaneous video and audio. I do know that there is a surge in, I think Talkspace is one of them that provide like chat therapy and things like that. Those, you know, in terms of the professional organizations, they still have a lot of concerns about that for a lot of, you know, some obvious, some not so obvious reasons. So it'll be interesting to see. I don't think they're going away, so I don't know what will happen with that. But when I talk about teletherapy, I'm talking about video and audio.
and you know, I know you probably will highlight it in your workshop in a couple of weeks, but also really being mindful of the state rules and don't assume you can just practice anybody around the country. There's a lot of guidelines.
Interjurisdictional issues.
Open it up to you guys. If you have questions or comments.
Yeah, question, Mike. I am curious about bias. It's I'm looking at this in my research in school, and it's my impression that there is a negative bias toward technology-assisted therapies of lots of kinds among clinicians, and that bias is less among clients and the general public, which I think also highlights like an ethical imperative to get over it for us. But I'm curious what you've seen among clinicians, like regarding that bias. Do you agree? Have you seen a shift?
I agree with you 100%.
Okay.
The biggest challenge that I run into is our members accepting teletherapy into their practice. And the research that's been done, predominantly it's us. It's the clinicians that are saying, I've never operated in this, you know, medium before, and I don't know how to adapt to all of these things. I want to just do it the way I've always done it, sitting across from somebody. And so that's one of the reasons that in my role as DPA, I really push a lot of teletherapy education, a lot of teletherapy training, because as people learn about it, it doesn't seem so scary. And, you know, I kind of continue to kind of bang the drum on like, this isn't going anywhere, guys. Like you know, it's not like we're just gonna forget about teletherapy and it's gonna disappear. Like, you're gonna be doing this at some point. It's just when are you going to do it? And, you know, I use there's at least 3 or 4 different bills right now in the state legislature on teletherapy. We're one of the few states that don't have really any legislative. Yeah, I know that we started with like 9. I think they had 9 at the beginning. And so I've been really, you know, reminding our members, this is, you know, we're gonna have legislation on this soon. And, you know, now is the time to get on board. And so I think a lot of it is just reassuring them. Even in my trainings, there's a lot of like, I know this is different, it's okay. But from what I've heard, you know, clients for the most part adapt very quickly, and it's not really an issue for them.
Have you seen a shift in bias among clinicians in recent years?
I have. I think more and more clinicians are wanting to add it to their therapy for a lot of different reasons. And I see more and more clinicians recognizing that they have a bias. They'll come and say, you know, I don't like this, but I know that this is something I need to learn how to do. So like, help me feel okay with doing this. So I think there's a lot more awareness of why they're not offering it.
Thank you. Are people, I'm cold. Are other people cold? Is it just me?
I can trust it.
If it's just me.
Yeah, you're literally right underneath.
All right, no, that's fine. It's just me. All right. Who's next up?
question about whether or not, because when I thought about bias is about just like the fear of the unknown, and if there's any work within master's programs about incorporating this into the actual education curriculum that's training these clinicians to begin with.
That's a really good question. I know that some programs are looking more into that, kind of including that in part of their training programs. I think not every program is there yet. And I honestly don't think we've hit that kind of key moment where it's gonna shoot up in popularity. I think we're really close. I think the key moment is like sometime next year. That like literally we're gonna hit that step where all of a sudden it's being required by health plans, lots of people are doing it, clients are asking for it, and I think at that point the training programs really will start to say we need to train people on how to do this.
All right, I think Chayton is going next.
Sure.
So you remember the prompts? You got the prompts? Anyone?
Yeah, you can repeat them. Yeah, I'd love to get the class.
Sam, I think that got cold and not warmer.
I just reset it.
Okay. Yes, thank you so much. Anybody want pop up your message?
I think
Brief intermission.
I know it's hard on the panel. What's next? Talk about your cultural identity and your social justice philosophy, and then you talk about how technology is impacting your professional practice.
Sure. Great. Well, first of all, just thank you so much for inviting me to come here, and thank you all for coming. My name's Chayton. I am the Director of Community Outreach at Sophia. We're a matchmaking service for therapy. We're also a software company that aspires to build software that allows great therapists to also run great businesses so that you can focus on what you do best, which is the work with the clients. In terms of my cultural identity, I think it impacts, so my parents are both from India, and I think it does impact, my relationship with mental health only because there's more of a concept of like, you're one with your family, there's less individuality in the Indian culture. So the idea of going to a therapist is just like a little strange for us. It's like, why would you talk to mom or talk to dad? Why are you going to this external third party to help you process things? And I think that impacts when people from cultural backgrounds like that are thinking about whether to reach out because they didn't grow up with it. If there is a barrier to accessing care, I think they're much more likely to quit because they're like, well, I don't really know if it's gonna help anyways. Versus like if your parents have gone to therapy or a family member has gone to therapy. So that certainly motivates my work a bit in that. So one of my co-founders, Eva, her story is basically she had a stressful episode in grad school where she had Bell's palsy, and that resulted in partial paralysis of her face for 4 months. And that having a great therapist was absolutely integral to getting through that and seeing it not just as a bad hand she had been dealt, but as an empowering experience. And she shared that story at grad school once she had gotten through it. And so many people came up to her afterwards saying like, oh my God, I've thought about looking for a therapist, or I'm looking for a good therapist, and I've had a really tough time. And so how my cultural identity plays into all of that is I was one of those people who kind of fell off with the wagon. I just talked to dad, which frankly was good. That's great.
That is very supportive.
Yeah. But like, it was family.
It's only so far.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a little bit about my cultural identity. I think what I wanted to share today was how technology can help reduce those barriers to care, and a concept that we at Sophia are starting to call supported search. So we are providing a matchmaking service for therapy, but as opposed to directory services where you have to kind of sort through and figure everything out yourself, we think it's really important to guide people through the process. So that's either some of those barriers can be eliminated or explained. So one of the things that guides us, I don't know if I really need all these slides, but is that therapists are key to therapy, which is not so controversial in a room of mostly therapists. But when we're talking to technologists, when we're talking to people from Silicon Valley, I think there's a divide between people who perceive there's a big shortage in mental health coverage in care. There's a shortage of mental health providers. So some people build technology to supplant them, and we believe it's really important to augment your reach and put you at the center of the equation. And so how that concept applies to supported search is basically like a lot of the innovations we do relate to technology, but some of them frankly just relate to humanity. And we came out of MIT kind of thinking like we were going to make this algorithm and it's going to be awesome. And I do think over time, as we collect more data, as we impact more lives, as we get more feedback, there's a lot of potential for machine learning and a lot of exciting technology to help improve our matchmaking. But frankly, a lot of the things that have made the difference as we get from 0 to 1 or 0 to 5, wherever we're at, is more just the humanity of it. So I'll talk about some of those innovations. But just to kind of demo our process right now, hopefully this works. So this is, you can go on our website, there's a form that you can fill out about what are the biggest issues you're dealing with. The form is a little longer than that, but that's just a demo. But then you have an option to book a call, to talk to someone, to get some advice on who to choose amongst your matches. And then we also kind of send people a short list of curated options that we think would be a great fit for them. The other thing that we're hoping to build out is also, more streamlined intake and logistics. I think you all probably see this all the time, but we've seen just people fall off the wagon if like the immediate response is like a little off, right? Or even like sometimes it may seem like a small thing, but just like all the forms you email people and like print them out and bring them to my office. It's like it's like kind of it's not fun. Doing things around payment, making it easy to collect payment in a way that doesn't really intrude on the relationship. Then we're also collecting reviews and referrals from the clients who go through our service, which I think we're able to do. We don't have like 100% response rate, but it's a much higher response rate because there's an intermediary asking, and I think there's a little bit of discomfort from, I mean, I'm sure in therapy sessions you all ask for feedback all the time, but there's like a different type of feedback that they can provide us. And then, as I said, like with the humanity element, just making sure to foster community on both sides of our platform, both amongst the therapists that are part of our network. And also we had our first kind of potential client-facing event last night where we were doing something called the Dating Psychology Lab, helping people to talk about, we're passionate about like the breakthroughs we have in individual therapy. As stigma starts to decrease, can we do more where we're talking about that in a group? And not just group therapy, which is, I think, approachable for people who have been to therapy, but can we have these workshops for people like, before they get into therapy to talk about some of those things. And then, so just in part, like, bring that down into the technology and humanity, and keep me honest on time because I've lost track of where.
3 minutes.
Okay, great. Just some of the things we do on the technology side that helps with this concept of supporting search is we do have a matching algorithm that helps us get to that short list of potential providers. For a while, I was doing it myself in an Excel sheet, and trust me, the algorithm is so much better. So much better. Personalized profiles. So, like, it's really hard to get a sense of a person's personality just by a picture and words. So can we do things over time, incorporating audio or video, or like audio that changes based off of what the person's looking for? Because one of the things I find that's problematic with static profiles is, say you are a sex therapist, you put that on your profile, it's going to really appeal to people who are looking for sex therapy, but it's going to turn off a broad swath of people who you could help as well. And I find, at least with most of the therapists we work with, we don't want people who are specialists in everything, but we do think it's legitimate to be able to treat anxiety, depression, life transitions, and then have a few niche specialties. And so we should be doing the work to kind of be able to allow you to illustrate that to the people who need it without turning the other people off. That, beautiful, easy online intake. Conversational marketing, we've started experimenting with chatbots and seeing like, can chatbots help people throughout the process? And the early results have been encouraging. So now when you get on the match screen that I showed, you'll see a little chatbot called Sophie pops up, and it's like, she can't do much, but she talks you through a couple things. She definitely increases the number of people who book calls, which is cool. Blog posts, in terms of just, I've seen so many therapists have blogs that have like 3 entries, which is great. Like those 3 entries are awesome. But can we aggregate them and kind of, the great thing about blog posts is if you do have a specialty, it allows people to like really understand your voice in a way that makes them much more comfortable about reaching out. Well, anyways, there's other stuff on the technology column, but I do want to at least briefly touch on humanity before I run out of time. Like, it's just, having the option to book a call with someone to talk about your matches, having email support, where we have blog posts on like, what are out-of-network benefits, what is insurance, what's in-network, what's out-of-network, what's all of this stuff. Having a good match guarantee. Just like, so the way Sophia works is we build a client for the first session, but if at any point in the first month they decide it's not a good fit, they can come back to us and ask for their money back, which we believe is important to, if people are going to make the investment for quality therapy, having mechanisms in place where they can be like, well, if it's not a good fit, what happens? And relatively few people take us up on that, but I think it allows a lot more people to get in the door. And then like things like having a therapist newsletter or therapist events, or I'm gonna plan a trip to Spectator Island for free yoga this summer. And I think that, well, you all would know better than me, it's always a little awkward talking to therapists because you know your profession much better, but like people appreciate the chance to know a psychiatrist in person, to cross the boundaries that, you probably know a lot of people who are other ACT specialists, but like getting to know other people who are not exactly the same as you has been pretty powerful.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Take one question. Comments?
I have a reaction, because I'm just like, this sounds really good, but then I think about like dual relationships, because then it's like, or like if you do go to this thing, is it like, okay, well, now we're kind of cool on Spectator Island, but then you probably can't be my client because that would be so I just think about that. Like, there's a part of me that really enjoys this idea of thinking outside of the box, but then I'm also another part that's just like, but my license is under these regulations that I think kind of makes that difficult.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, to clarify, when I talk about the events, we have therapist events, and then we have, client events where if there's a therapist there, it's like they are facilitating a conversation on dating or on relationships. So it's not like mixing the two in a social setting. But yeah, I think your question also is kind of apt to, like, what is the role of an intermediary in this relationship? And frankly, like, it's something we navigate and try to get guidance from the people who are working with us every day. Like, where are we helpful? Where are we not helpful?
Any other? All right, so we're going to turn it over to Andy.
Let's see if I can do this.
Stop testing.
Yeah. So do you know if you're gonna want to cast your desktop?
I did not count that in your time.
Your
Very
time.
generous.
Yes, thank you. So thank you again, Carmen, for hosting us this evening, and thank you all for coming out. My name is Andy Reamer. I can use the pronouns he, him, his. I am a male, cisgendered, and I'm mixed race, Chinese and white Jewish, but I'm very white facing, and so this kind of leads into the work that I've been doing as well, not related to SHIELD, but also my social justice identity theory, wherein I'm currently about to graduate from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and when I came there, I was really interested in looking more into how to bring digital technologies to young people, and specifically I was interested in failing. And through this time and talking with adults there and fellow students, I've been really interested in this concept of discomfort and how discomfort can be a place to lean into as well as a place for empathy and support and compassion. So during my time at Hugsy, I am an Equity and Inclusion Fellow, which means that I host and hold space for a variety of difficult, quote unquote, difficult conversations, whether that's cross-racial dialogues or talking about gender or sexuality. I've held space specifically, an affinity space for Asian American men to talk about masculinity and the model minority myth and how Asian American and Asian identities fall into that and intersect with that. I also started an affinity space for the first time at Hugsy and actually broadly at Harvard for mixed race or multiracial individuals. And we just held an event a couple weeks ago about cross-racial relationships as well as having a multiracial identity. And that was a really great positive space to hold. And so coming back to how SHIELD was developed, I've told this story to you, but my journey with mental health and psychology started back 16. So I'm a digital native, but not a social media native like a lot of young people are now. And so I was 16 and Facebook was just coming out, and I wake up one morning, go on Facebook, log on, and I see that one of my friends had just died from suicide. And so at that point of my life, I went through her posts and my posts and my friend's posts and trying to figure out if there's anything that someone could have done to prevent that from happening. And that really drove me, along with all my own personal experiences, towards psychology. I gained my degree in psychology from Georgetown, played pro soccer briefly, got my leg broken pretty quickly, retired, came back and did some research on Asian American masculinity. I did some, I was the survey analyst for Ed Week for a little bit, looking nationally at national trends of educators. Specifically, what I was really interested in was growth mindset, and it was really interesting around social desirability as well on filling out these surveys. And then in December, I was talking to my brother, and he is 16 now, and he's a social media native. He's always known social media. He's on Snapchat mainly, although he says to me that he gets his news from Instagram, but he talks to his friends on Snapchat. And then he, as well as my sister, as well as my brother, all have this thing called Finstas, which are fake Instagrams. Meaning that they specifically curate their public-facing one, and then they have a Finsta that's specifically for their closer friends that is more goofy, maybe more quote-unquote authentic, depending on how you might look at it. There could be a tertiary Finsta for some people, depending on how much time they want to put towards this. And so I was talking to him, and he had heard about 3 suicides over the course of 3 weeks in the DC area. Friends of friends, where the families wanted privacy, but the kids heard about it through social media. And so all the kids were talking about it on Snapchat mainly, but they didn't go to their high school counselor, they didn't go and really talk to their parents, as my brother didn't at the time. And so they were just trying to figure it out on social media. And so that reminded me of when I was just trying to figure it out on social media. And so I came back to Harvard in the spring, in January, started trying to grapple with this idea of how I could try to leverage social media and all the work that I've been learning from Emily around social media and you're going to be too modest, so I'll say that her most recent journal article is brilliant that came out just recently, like a month ago. Anyways, it's a seesaw that she was talking about the pros and minuses and how both of those can have impact in any case. So trying to figure out how we can try to use social media to bring mental health resources and be more accessible to young people in particular, particularly young people with marginalized identities. Another key person in thinking about this was I attended AOCC, which is the Alumni of Color Conference at Harvard Graduate School of Education, and a graduate is now getting her doctorate at NYU in psychiatry, I believe. And her name is Anika Carter, and she has a presentation called the hashtag era of trauma, or the trauma hashtag or something along those lines. I apologize, I should have written it down. But basically what it points to is that people, but particularly people of color and particularly black people and young black kids are having PTSD because on social media they see constantly or often young black boys in particular being killed, which has the positive and negative. Positive shedding a light on the thing that's been covered up for so long, and a negative because they see themselves in that position, and then it's double fold when the police officer is not found guilty. And so there's this theory around, well, how do you deal with social media in that way, because it's both a positive and a negative. So with SHIELD, we're trying to provide multiple avenues down this waterfall as I've been trying to think about it. So at the edge of this waterfall, at the precipice, there's suicide and very extreme mental health crises. And this is where a lot of colleges and that's where high schools, they focus on that, or that's where they only have the resources and time to focus on right now. And what we're trying to do is open that up and to provide multiple avenues for them to gain psychoeducation and positive resources further upstream. And so there's our mission statement. We're trying to leverage social media to prevent mental health crises and promote wellness of young adults, particularly with those with marginalized identities, because again, social media can be a positive when they can find a community and they can express an identity that might be suppressed. This is from Pew, and so it's probably a little bit conservative in its numbers, as Emily was talking about earlier, but Pew has the numbers of 80% of kids between 18 and 24 are on Snapchat and Instagram, and that's all adolescents, not just those that have cell phones, but all 18 to 24-year-olds, 80% are on Snapchat and Instagram, and I guarantee that it's higher for younger kids. So we see, this is an example of what Snapchat looks like. If this was a real model, then this would be your front-facing camera. And there's two different sides to it. There's a chat function where you talk to your friends, and there's the story function, which is more general. I won't put air quotes, but it is air quotes around news. They do have the Washington Post and things like that, but oftentimes it's People and Us Magazine and Sports Illustrated, things like that. So what we envision is being able to provide both if they have us as a contact, as well as if they have us just searching around, to provide these videos that are thematic. So this is Will, one of my team members who's focused, who's getting his degree from Hugsy in school psychiatry or school psychology. And he is talking about how he encourages his students to talk about, to listen to music individually or together, and then talk about the emotions that come up with it. And so we're hoping that we can develop these libraries of videos that are mental health professionals as well as therapists in training to talk about different things, whether it's academic stressors or relationship stressors or music, but also affinity spaces for gender and sexuality and race and ethnicities. And then also encourage young people to upload their own videos. A little bit of quality control along the way, but what we're trying to do is really allow them to speak their own truth and give them that space and power of speaking it, because I think that a lot of young people now, with headspace becoming more popular and mental health becoming a little bit less stigmatized, or at least like people are somewhat talking about it and it's somewhat in the media, even when they do it poorly, like 13 Reasons Why. But people are trying to talk about it. The NBA is trying to talk about it now. They may think that there's only one way to do it. There's only one way to practice mindfulness. There's only one way to manage my stress. And so what we would like to show is how the variety in different ways that you can address academic and social and relationship stressors, as well as the commonalities throughout that. We're also hoping to provide them with non-emergency answers, so they can snap us, which is just a message over Snapchat, or DM us with an Instagram. We're talking with AI people to see whether or not that might be a possibility, because it's a non-emergency ask. But we're also partnered with Aunt Bertha, which is a wraparound service, or a search portal for wraparound services that are free and reduced. A really interesting organization based out in Austin. Basically, you type in your zip code, you select what filters you might want. In the larger one, you have the options of physical health and food and mental health and doctors and stuff like that. But for us, it would be specifically focused on mental health, and they could choose the personal filters and find out what's in their area, or if we partner with colleges, what's specifically available to them on campus or close to campus that works with their student insurance or works that's free and reduced for them. And then at the crisis level, we're hoping that we can provide them with a series of crisis hotlines so that they don't have to go and search for an actual suicide lifeline and copy and paste that into the phone app, but instead putting it directly in Snapchat or Instagram so that they can see the menu, press the one that they need to connect with, and call from not within the app, because that would require the National Suicide Lifeline to have a Snapchat as well, but it's a pretty easy link to press a button, you set OK, and it'll call on your regular phone. And so that's something where I was at the breakfast this morning for Samaritans for Break the Silence. Really powerful, really great breakfast and speakers talking about wanting to break the silence and wanting to start these conversations. And I think that we are on the cusp, I think, of being able to talk about these, especially at the emergency level. But I think that there's still work to be done in upstream, as well as the coping with. So I was listening to NPR the other day, and somebody's going around to every high school and talking about their personal struggles with mental health. That's great, but I think that then begs the question, and now what? And so that's where we're trying to provide some high-level answers as well as connections to resources on and offline.
Thank you. And yeah, Andy, when was that, back in January?
Yeah, and then we met pretty shortly after that.
Reached out to me about talk about some project. I'm like, oh, who's this? Wanted to talk about some project, and he was very persistent. And so I finally responded to his email, and then we chatted a bit on phone. And the minute he says, like, oh my God, this is great, because I know the students at my high school, Snapchat is the end-all be-all for them. You know, when I was younger, I would try to kind of access things that students are on, just so I could keep up. I have not been able to do stuff. I hear, I listen, and I ask questions, but I have not ventured into trying it out. But that's one of my goals. But yeah, the project you talked about, I think it's going to be such a great resource for our students, and I know you focusing on college students initially, but I think it's a great avenue as we think about destigmatizing mental health and make it more accessible for people. We have to go where they're at. We have to go where they're at. Questions, comments?
I'm just thinking from like personal experience on social media recently, how I was very surprised that I didn't know that May was Mental Health Awareness Month or whatever. I had no clue. No one knows. I mean, it's just not there. So what's going on with that, and like what could we do, you know, in the future to make it more seen? I posted a status today, you know, this quote or whatever, and I was brave because honestly I was worried about the stigma. Like, this is something we all deal with as providers too. Like, it doesn't stop with just the adolescents and everyone. Like, I still feel that way. So I guess I don't know what, I guess I'm just venting a little bit, but I just don't get it. Like, there's no videos reaching out about this cause in any way. Like, there's so many inspirational videos now on Facebook about like everything, but there's nothing about this.
Well, I agree, and I think that this is where, and then there's more artists and celebrities and athletes coming out and talking about their own mental health concerns and taking this on as their cause, but there's still not like, there's no unified voice, but there's also no real content, because what I've noticed with talking to the Samaritans and with talking with with JED Foundation and with a lot of these really well-known organizations is that they're having a hard time connecting with young people because they're, in particular with the video content, what I've noticed is that the video content is really beautiful. They spend so much money on building these beautiful video pieces that are really effective for me and older, but for younger people than me, they feel like it's very top down and unauthentic. And they much rather have somebody selfieing that's like got half of their face in it or on the ground, and somebody talking from that's more authentic than a really beautifully shot video. And those beautifully shot videos hit the funders and great, but I think that it's also important to try to encourage these grassroots movements.
And we're open up to just, again, this is a great conversation. I love this because I always learn from what we're planning to share, and I think we've learned a lot today. And I'll summarize this, there's a lot for me. I usually need more time to process, but there was a great amount of pieces of information that you all shared today, and we'll look to make sure we get some of the resources, the articles that you shared, you wrote. I want to add that when I do the share after post. But I'd love to open it up to the general audience if you have any questions, comments, or predictions. Thinking also about how do you take this information and apply it to your practice as well.
I'll make a comment. I know I haven't interacted as much with kind of the other people that are in this area. I know Charmaine's done a lot more of that. I'm just very happy to see the level of data-driven work that's being done. That it's not just people coming up with ideas, but people looking at what does the data say, what do we know works, and then incorporating that with a new idea, and let's see how that works, and let's take a look at that. And I know, you know, for Sophia too, you know, he reached out to us early on because he was like, I want to know what do providers deal with, and I know you did that with a lot of people to really kind of learn what is it that's going on from the people that are dealing with it. So, you know, it's very heartening for me to know that from all of these different aspects, you know, in terms of different approaches, that there's still this thought of, you know, we need to really understand these issues and learn more about them.
Well, I can share. But I'm coming new into the field. I graduate on Saturday. But I know mental health awareness is key for me because through my own lived experience. And so that I would like to share with you that July is Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. And so we try to get that out there. And I try to put it on my Facebook page. I'm still trying to learn how to do Snapchat. But, you know, I'm trying to learn these things so I can get it out there. And so I'm be supportive. You know, I'm here just to learn for myself, but I'm also on the state board for NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. And so that's what we try to do, just advocacy and get the word out there. I would love to, there's some things I still don't know about the legalities of, you know, FaceTime and doing therapy. I just thought, you know, you could do that, but there's still things to learn. But I know we can't get past the personal piece. So, but a couple of things, I just want to put that out there as well.
Thank you for sharing that, July.
July.
I feel like but again, like, we're not, how are we getting the message across around these really important opportunities to highlight and lift up mental health, which we know is kind of like on the bottom of the totem pole, right? The stigma really impacts us. Learning or even leaning in, trying to dig in and get more information about it. Even though many of us or family members or friends struggle with these issues. Any other questions, comments, observations?
I think that's why technology is potentially the way forward, because I find in conversations with people who do feel stigmatized or people who deny that mental health is an issue, or providers, because sometimes I feel in spaces that, you know, we kind of like preach to the choir. People who show up are people who already believe in it or feel like it's an issue or are ready to do something about it. And so I feel like regardless, everybody, wherever you are, is using a phone, you know, whether you acknowledge it or not. And so that's why I get so excited about it, because I'm just like, everyone, whether you acknowledge it or not, is using a phone. How to get into that feed, whether they want to or not, whether it's an ad on the side or whether there's a hashtag or something like that. So I think that's what gets me excited, because it's like there's a way in to essentially 80% of people.
Right, we really need people who are coming out and fresh in their education. I know you two are about to graduate as well. We have a lot of upcoming graduates. I mean, I think about, you know, I graduated in 2001 with my degree, and so much has changed. I'm a learner by default anyway, and so I'm always digging in and really thinking about how we really get the information out, how do we have these conversations about these really important issues. Any other comments?
Well, I guess I'm thinking about the other 20%, you know, also, because I think the narrative, it's so clear that technology is poised to address a glaring gap in mental health care coverage, and still I'm thinking about and wondering about the areas that are still without broadband access, and there, you know, there is 20% is a lot of folks without smartphones, if that's what the data is. So I don't know, I guess, what do you guys think about, like, how is technology relevant to that segment of people in this area? Or is that sort of another thing entirely?
I'll briefly clarify my stat and then other people answer, but that stat is specifically for who's on Snapchat and Instagram, like on a pretty consistent basis, and specifically for that age group.
I think you raise a really great point about access to technology, and I think that's something I see also in my school, particularly around schoolwork and expectations around homework, particularly if there's technology based. You know, there are many students in my school without access to Wi-Fi, but the assumption is everybody has it, and they do in some way. You know, there are libraries and things like that, but it's not, may not be easily accessible. So I think getting to that other percentage is important, and we also, how do we get to the people who already have it? I think it's not like an either or. How do we kind of do both of those things? It's crucial.
I think that number is getting smaller and smaller, so that that stat is from the 2015 Pew report and the 2017 like AP, the organization that put out the update. The numbers are even higher, even for that among teens. But we're also seeing, I think we will see, like in New York City now there are public Wi-Fi hotspots in different places, and I think as we see more a push just across the board for more connectivity, we'll have even better access to those populations. Of course, there is going to continue to be a divide around access, but I think it's getting smaller. We're seeing also schools sending home devices, you know, public schools moving to one-to-one programs where kids are being given access to personal devices that they can take home with them. So as we see like the combination of more access to technology, I think through schools, more connectivity, we'll see that gap get smaller and smaller. It's going to mean that the people who don't have access get harder and harder for us to reach, and are even more important for us to think about, really in a really intentional way. But that's, I don't know, that's just part of, I guess, how I'm grappling with that.
Yeah, and I think
I think about it from like an age perspective again, because the population that I work with, most of them do not have smartphones. And I think that, you know, they tend to be very technology averse. I don't foresee that changing, so I would be interested to see like what is the breakdown of age range, because I could see like older adults not having a smartphone is not uncommon, but if you're talking about like a teenager that doesn't have a smartphone, I would see that as like a very different scenario, and like what are they missing out on and things like that. So I tend to think of it from an age perspective.
Also, some of them, like Instagram, you can access from a desktop, from a computer. So even if you don't have a smartphone, if you have a computer that you have access to, you could go on that platform, just as one example.
Yeah, a couple of them have
Nice
Facebook.
issue.
They're pretty excited about it.
Yeah.
It's exciting. And I think, you know, I go back to this whole idea of digital natives and digital immigrant people who are not born into the generation and the social media natives versus the non-social media natives. And I think a lot of people who are making policies and decisions and curricula, you know, they're not born into, at this stage, into where the students are at. And your example about the videos really highlights this. How we're really making sure that we're including the voices of people who we're trying to target or reach. You know, that's so important. Oftentimes we think we know it all and we have all the ideas, but it's so important to kind of bring that lens and bring those people to the table so that they can help guide our policies, our curricular, you know, practices that we're doing.
Just one more thing about, so if you're using like your home space, just not everyone has like a space in the home that would be appropriate for therapy sessions, just another thing coming to mind.
That's a good
but-
point.
Actually, one of my
Keep that
clients,
in mind.
she does it in her car, because it's a
Yeah.
small apartment and she goes out in her car, she looks at her
Yeah.
headphones, so.
Okay.
People are being creative about that.
Yeah.
So, but that is key and important to
Yeah.
make sure other people can listen to the session. So I will just wrap up again. Thank you. Some of the things that I highlighted, Jeff takes really great notes. Really think about the data. Really think about the data and, you know, who is using technology. We're seeing technology not going away. Most people in the world, in the US, have access to internet and our cell phones. And how are we really gonna use that information to go where clients are at? Love your points about the positives and the negatives about technology, and you know, tend to my generation, I think, focus on the negative pieces, but really how we're embracing and understanding through the lens of our clients how technology impacts their lives. Like, that's such key information that we need to know. And you know, it's kind of, I do a lot of work in schools. Prior to that, I was an outpatient therapist only, and working in the schools, you get so much more information about students. And I think it's operating like that. If you're not connecting to their social media world and not understanding it, you're missing huge amounts of information about their lives and their relationships. Appreciate, Chaitan, and your concept of really, I love the supported search, because I know, like, psychology today, when I was looking for my own therapist, I go on and I feel like I'm very judgmental, because I'm like, oh, I don't like how they're looking at the picture. I don't like how But having that supported search, I think it's a great model and idea, because people then, there's help through that process. And then, again, I love the work that you're doing. I can't wait to see, you know, he was recently, the company, they went through the Harvard Business School pitch and placed 4th, and now they're gonna be in the Mass Challenge, which is another incubator, accelerator. So they're, you know, I think everybody's connecting to the impact that it's gonna have, so I can't wait to see that. So thank you all. I have an evaluation form because your feedback is crucial to be developed in these workshops. We have one more in June, and then we'll take a break and kind of reassess. I'm gonna come back bigger and stronger in the fall. I'm gonna address xenophobia, religion. We did racism. People are like, we need to do more of this. So there are more topics that we want to address. If you have connections to sponsors, I'd love to know that so we can get the word out. And what else? Yeah, that's it. I'm here if you have any questions, and I want to talk to you a little bit about kind of your business as well. So please spend some time networking, and thank you again. I have a few recordings for you guys.
Thank you so much.
Everybody do the bow and then.
can hear us.